A very strange incident involving a laser weapon to take out drones that turned out to be a balloon and revealed a whole bunch of disconnection within the Trump administration happened in El Paso. We'll talk about that. DHS right now is shut down because the Congress cannot agree on a way forward as Democrats demand some deep reforms to ICE and CBP. We will see how deep those reforms actually end up being. And there's a lot of reasons too for concern about organizational cultural problems within DHS's fast growing law enforcement organizations. There's just a huge expansion of migrant detention that's about to happen. We're seeing new details about ICE's rethinking of migrant detention, trying to remake the detention system as a series of giant warehouses around the country. $38 billion, while the courts are upholding some of the Trump administration's efforts to make detention mandatory for possibly millions of people living in the United States. Border wall plans are raising enormous environmental and cultural concerns as they move forward with waivers in the law. And CBP published new data from January showing a pretty low number of migrants in the dead of winter, but also the lowest number that we've seen really since 2011 when we started getting numbers of families and children arriving at the border. I'm Adam Isaacson. I write a regular border update. I have since the fall of 2020 for my job at the Washington office on Latin America. This is just an extra video and audio where I try to figure out how to use multimedia and how to communicate better. And one way to do that is to simply run through these very long updates that I end up writing every 2 weeks. All right, let's talk about the drone incident on February 11th. You probably remember that in the news and then it went away. But yeah, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, closed down airspace in El Paso and around El Paso, the international airport, a pretty big metro area, and they were going to do it for 10 days before they backed down. The reason, we had no idea why for much of the day on the 11th, but the reason it turned out, okay, the story starts, I guess, in late January, where the Defense Department approved a request from CBP to use some of the department's new anti-drone laser technology, military technology to take out drones using like directed energy. The FAA got wind of this, and in early February, they sent an email to the Pentagon saying that deploying a laser without even warning people so they could clear the airspace around a very populated area would create a grave risk of fatalities or permanent injuries to civilians anywhere in the air nearby. They were going to meet actually today, February 20th, people from DoD and FAA to talk about this potential use of laser weapons. But Pentagon officials sort of jumped the gun. They said, some of them at least said, we've already satisfied our requirement that we consult with you. We're going to move ahead. So sometime, it looked like before dawn on February 9th, members of a CBP tactical unit with military people alongside them fired a 20 kilowatt directed energy laser weapon, something called a locust system, at what they thought was a drone floating over from Ciudad Juarez. They were in El Paso, somewhere near, there's a big complex where the airport touches Fort Bliss, this sprawling army base, somewhere around there, about 5 miles maybe north of the actual borderline with Ciudad Juarez. So they fired this locust system at what they thought was a target of a Mexican cartel drone. It was actually, I guess, a Mylar party balloon. After learning that this happened in, relatively crowded airspace, the next day on the 10th, at the end of the day, the administrator of the FAA said, no, I'm going to shut down airspace until I know what's going on. And they ordered a 10-day shutdown of the airport and all the surrounding airspace. The Trump administration didn't come up with an explanation all day on the 11th of why this was happening. By late morning, the airport was reopened. I guess there had been a pledge not to do this with the directed weapons again. But the administration really didn't clearly explain what was going on, and reporters sort of had to dig it up. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the government in Mexico City heard that they were closing all this airspace at the border. They'd seen what had just happened in Venezuela a month and a half ago and were worried that the Trump administration was about to carry out a non-consensual strike inside Mexican territory, maybe in Chihuahua across from Southwest Texas. None of that ended up happening, and now we know what actually did happen. It really showed this really poor coordination and lack of communication within the Trump administration itself. But the issue is something that does deserve some attention. I mean, Mexican criminal groups obviously are trying to move products across the border. It's a very profitable part of Mexican territory for them. They compete about a lot. And, for years at the border, we've always heard of halcones or hawks, falcons, which are people whose job it is just kind of like stand at some vantage point and keep an eye on what's going on the border. So they know, for instance, if Border Patrol has moved away and they can move some products or people across, but just to have a sense of what's going on. Obviously, spending a few $100 on a few drones from Amazon can do what those Alconas were doing in many areas. So surveillance is a big reason why organized crime might be using drones. Another reason, these drones can't carry a lot of things. They don't have a lot of battery power, but the cheap Amazon drone can still carry small amounts of fentanyl or methamphetamine or some other lightweight synthetic drug if they wanted to make a delivery. The DHS officials were telling Congress in the middle of last year that they were seeing as many as 35,000 drones detected within 500 meters of the U.S.-Mexico border in a year, and that it was a major topic of concern expressed in meetings between U.S. and Mexican officials. Further down in Mexico, there have been many now examples of cartels actually when they fight each other, when they fight the Mexican forces, or even when they're just trying to displace innocent civilian populations, using armed drones or drones laden with explosives to kill their rivals. That hasn't happened much near the border, although there was an incident in October where an explosives-laden drone was used to attack a prosecutor's office in Tijuana. You might want to keep an eye on it. It is a bipartisan thing. In New Mexico, the Democratic majority legislature looks like they're going to pass a bill to give their local law enforcement more of an anti-drone authority and capacity as well. But yeah, the incident pointed out that the Trump administration is completely unprepared and unequipped for dealing with this. They're not even really considering the risks to civilians of shooting lasers into the sky in places with a crowded airspace. But the United States is going to need some sort of response to the incursions of unmanned apparatuses from criminal groups. All right, so the Department of Homeland Security is officially shut down. Most employees, your TSA agents and the airport and others are not getting paid right now, even if they're being forced to work. Many others are simply furloughed. That is not the case, though, for the two really big law enforcement agencies within DHS, ICE and CBP. They both have piles of money from the so-called Big Beautiful Bill Act that passed last July. I think it's like $75 billion for ICE and about $65 billion. Don't quote me exactly on that because I don't have the numbers in front of me for CBP. And they can use that money to pay their officials and their agents while this shutdown continues. But it is the reason that this is the one budget bill that the Congress has been unable to pass for 2026, is obviously the controversial nature and very politicized nature of DHS and the way it's been being used against migrants, but also against protesters and critics of the administration. I think the killings in Minneapolis in January of Renee Good and Alex Pretty were the last straw for even the most cautious centrist Democrats. They are demanding a series of reforms to those agencies as a condition of their support for a bill. Now, the Democrats are in the minority, but if you don't know the arcane ways that the U.S. Congress works, the U.S. Senate has 100 members. They need 60 members to vote to sign off on going ahead and voting with the bill, basically voting to end debate and start voting. They call that the filibuster. The Democrats do have 47 members and maybe peeling off one or two Republicans as well. So even if there's a majority of the Senate that would pass the bill in its current form without the reforms, Democrats can use these parliamentary rules to stop the bill, which is what they have done. There's another way to get bills passed like once a year if it only affects budget. Once or twice a year, a special rule called a reconciliation. That is what Congress used to pass the Big Beautiful Bill last year without a single Democratic vote. So this shutdown is going to continue until there can be some agreement on reforms. The Democrats published a list of 10 demands for what kind of reforms they want to see. Some of them are kind of vague, but there's a pretty clear demand to require judicial warrants for ICE to be able to enter residences. A judge has to sign off, where ICE just can't say, we gave ourselves an administrative warrant to barge into your home, which they're doing right now. The Democrats are also insisting on a demasking of ICE agents, that they can no longer hide their identities and look like scary secret police when they're out on the street. They must wear some sort of ID. The list includes protecting sensitive locations, stopping racial profiling, tightening use of force standards, coordinating better with state and local authorities, building some more safeguards in the detention system, including letting members of Congress pay unannounced inspection visits, more mandate of body cameras, then something they're calling no paramilitary police, which makes sense to have these law enforcement agencies stop acting like they are some sort of hyper paramilitary squad. Now, a lot of items that are not on that list are things that a lot of advocates have been asking for. Well, obviously, clawing back some of the funds from the big bill. Bernie Sanders actually introduced an amendment earlier to take back the $75 billion that the big bill had given ICE. And 49 members of the Senate out of 100 did vote for it, including 2 Republicans and all Democrats. So that's not as far-fetched a request as you might think. These asks don't include limits on agents' immunity that they have from being sued right now, which was strengthened by a Supreme Court decision, Bivens, a couple of years ago. The reestablishment of the oversight bodies inside DHS, like the Civil Rights Civil Liberties Office and the Office of the Detention Ombudsman, who had nearly all of their staffs fired by the Trump administration during the first months of 2025. Establishing a use of force review board for ICE, sort of like what exists in CBP, although they don't really hand out a lot of punishments, but at least having one. Or, like many are calling for, even just abolishing ICE and replacing it with something else. Now, yeah, the Republicans have said that most of those things are no starters. They are especially standing stubbornly on the issue of administrative warrants for entering residences and on masking of DHS. So that is stuck for now. But all of the incidents in January in Minnesota have raised awareness of the need to really address these organizational culture concerns at ICE and CBP. The way they've been behaving and quote on video behaving is unacceptable to most Americans, as polls are showing. And it's really the first time we've had the spotlight shown brightly on concerns that groups like WOLA, Southern Border Communities Coalition, ACLU, and others have been documenting for quite a while. So that is becoming more of an issue. There are more concerns about what this means for U.S. democracy. This border update doesn't really cover what's happening in Minnesota and the U.S. interior. That would be an entire other update we would have to write. We are trying to keep the focus on the border, although, as you can see, we are bleeding over into a lot of things that are happening in the U.S. interior because these are often the same people and the same agencies involved. Other things that attracted attention in the last couple of weeks, NBC News did a review of just dozens of incidents of use of so-called less lethal weapons like tear gas, pepper spray, rubber bullets, showing just a lot of people being injured in ways that can only happen if law enforcement personnel are using those weapons exactly how they are warned in their manuals and in their training not to use those weapons, like shooting pepper spray right into somebody's eye, shooting tear gas canisters at people's heads and chests. That is not less lethal, and it's quite dangerous. And NBC News found a lot of examples of that. There's a lot of discussion still over the insistence on using masks. Folks like Border Czar Tom Homan and another DHS leadership have been defending masks, saying they're necessary to prevent doxing of law enforcement agents wearing the masks. But of course, police all over the United States go unmasked. There's nothing particularly different or special about federal agents. Defenders of masking claim an increase in assaults. That increase went from 10 during the first 6 months of 2024 to 79 in all of 2025. An increase, but there's also been a huge increase in the operational tempo and simply number of agents in confrontational positions over the course of the last year. Bradley Balco, a journalist who's looked into this a lot, noted that no immigration agent has been killed in the line of duty since 1949. According to data compiled by the Cato Institute, 2025 was actually the second safest year ever for ICE officers and Border Patrol agents. Another issue is the overuse of administrative subpoenas. DHS has been sending social media platforms and internet platforms, Google, Reddit, Discord, Meta, these subpoenas when somebody is talking on social media about following or monitoring ICE or criticizing the agency, demanding that those companies release all the contact information and other information associated with those people, which seems awfully dangerous. And the Washington Post reported on February 3rd about a U.S. retiree, I believe he was in Virginia, I don't have the article in front of me, for whom DHS asked Google, or actually subpoenaed Google, to get all of the contents of his Google account, his Gmail and everything else, after all he'd done was send a letter to a DHS lawyer urging mercy for an asylum seeker after he'd seen an article about the asylum seeker. That really seems like really strong overreach. Wired magazine had an interesting piece that's just worth a read. I'm not going to even try to summarize it, just detailing the contents of a forum were active and former agents, mostly at ICE Homeland Security Investigations Division, are reacting to and debating what has been happening in Minnesota and elsewhere. It's an interesting glimpse into the organizational culture. Some are very gung-ho, but some are also very disturbed by what they're seeing and are recognizing it as super bad for their institutions. Now, organizational culture problems are all the way at the top, too. There have been some big shifts at DHS. We've all seen how Greg Bovino has fallen off the radar. The at-large commander has been relegated back to being the sector chief in El Centro, California, one of the quieter Border Patrol sectors. That was his job before the Trump administration took over and promoted him. We've also seen the impending departure of Tricia McLaughlin, who is the rather outspoken and abrasive spokesperson for all of DHS over the last year. Much of what she said required fact-checking, a lot of mischaracterization of people who are not criminals or terrorists as criminals or terrorists. Secretary Noem, Kristi Noem, her job is not safe at the moment. There have been a few articles that we linked to in the update, just full of juicy gossip about how much of the rank and file at DHS, but also some folks in the White House appear to be pretty unhappy with her flashy, camera-ready, making lots of videos style, which of course led to management lapses like what we've seen and very aggressive politicized behavior like what we've seen in Minnesota. It's not clear whether she's going to be able to stay. In fact, in terms of oversight of DHS, there were hearings in the House and Senate with the commissioners of ICE and CBP as witnesses. We didn't learn a lot, but it was interesting that they wouldn't comment on the violence that happened in Minnesota or the killings of Good and Pratt D. It was interesting to hear Rand Paul, who's a Republican from Kentucky, a very committed libertarian, so unlike most Republicans in the Senate, not a blind supporter of Donald Trump, saying some very critical things about how DHS has been behaving. Paul, of course, is the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee in this Senate. It was interesting to see in the House hearing when a member of the House asked Todd Lyons, the acting director of ICE, whether he thought Kristi Noem should resign. He did not defend her. He said, I'm just not going to comment on that. There's some concerns when we're talking about oversight that DHS's inspector general, who is a Trump appointee from Trump's first term and has come under a lot of fire for not being very energetic about overseeing ICE and CBP. Senator Duckworth from Illinois had asked the IG to look into some of the abuses committed when Bovino and the same group of Border Patrol, CBP, and ICE agents were in Chicago in September through November. And the Inspector General, Joseph Ghaffari, declined to do it and actually told her that he gotten a request from Secretary Noem for a list of all their ongoing investigations with sort of a veiled threat that Noem actually does have a very limited, rarely invoked power to actually cancel investigations, which is a real troubling amount of interference with an Inspector General's office that is just useless if it's not actually independent. And that is definitely affecting the independence of an Inspector General's office that was already had its real independence already in doubt. If you want to know more about Joseph Ghaffari, Google the words bad watchdog and just an award-winning podcast series about this that the Project of Government Oversight produced a couple of years ago. But that's a different issue. And then there have been some more attention paid to the really untimely evisceration last March of DHS's Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office and its Office for the Detention Ombudsman. These were not very powerful offices, but they did receive complaints. They did follow up on a lot of them. They would at least have a lot of the information about bad stuff that was going on within the organization. If anything, they should have been strengthened, but they actually had all but just a tiny handful of their staff fired during the Doge period of the early Trump administration. And so that crucial oversight capacity is gone right now. A huge issue here, and I sort of treated it separately from the overall organizational culture / government shutdown issue, because it's really, this might even be the most important issue in this update, and maybe of everything we're going to cover this year, is migrant detention. For now, there has not been, there has been an increase in the detained population. Right now, it's 68,000 people, as of the last report that ICE submitted, are currently in ICE's detention system, these mostly contractor-run facilities around the country where they keep migrants who are either being held without bond as they wait for their immigration cases to go through or who are about to be staged for deportation. 68,000 people is not the record. The record was in ICE's last report about 2 weeks earlier. That was 70,766 people. For perspective, when the Biden administration left, the detained population was about 38 or 39,000 people. So, getting close to doubling what it was a year ago. But it hasn't really been increasing dramatically yet. And in fact, the number of arrests per day has been really between 1,100 and 1,200 since October for ICE's operations in the field. We expect that to change. We expect it to change pretty dramatically for obvious reasons. The One Big Bill Act has allowed ICE to hire as many as 12,000 new people. Not all of those are agents who will be out in the field, but most of them are, which will be nearly tripling the size of its deportation force. And probably even more concerningly, ICE has $45 billion from that bill to expand detention. And a big chunk of that plan, $38.3 billion, which ICE is calling its detention reengineering initiative, is now underway. You might know this as their warehouse plan. The news of this is getting out nowhere near as much as it should be getting out, considering just how historically alarming this is. But this is a plan that would increase ICE's detention capacity by 92,600 beds. There would be 8 warehouses. ICE is buying 8 warehouses around the country, each of which could hold 7,000 to 10,000 people, these sort of mega centers. And they expect, according to a memo that the governor's office of New Hampshire released, because they're planning to open one of these in New Hampshire, those would hold people for about 60 days or so. 7,000 to 10,000 people each. There would be 16 more regional processing centers where people would maybe go beforehand. Those will hold 1,000 to 1,500 people in these big windowless warehouses for average stays of 3 to 7 days. ICE would buy 10 of its already existing facilities, and it expects to have them all up and running somehow. I don't think they'll make this, but by November 30th of this year. The memo that the New Hampshire state government released says the new sites will serve as ICE's long-term detention solution. There's a great citizen initiative based in Baltimore called Project Saltbox. They're aggregating data about these warehouses, and they've identified mega centers that have already been purchased, not renovated and ready for use, but purchased in Tremont, Pennsylvania, Socorro and Clinton, Texas, and Social Circle, Georgia. Then they've identified a bunch of the processing sites as well. Some of this is going to be facilitated by use of a special Navy program that's only a few years old and not really meant for the continental United States, but they've expanded it and given a $55 billion contracting ceiling to ICE, which will allow them to issue a lot of these contracts for setting up these warehouses without going through bidding and other anti-corruption measures and other red tape that normally slows down federal contracting. So there's this Navy program with the friendly name Wexmac Titus might allow ICE to expand super rapidly, far more rapidly than they would if they were acting like a normal government agency. There is some opposition to these warehouses and communities, and sales have been stopped or blocked in Ashland, Virginia, and Kansas City, Oklahoma City, Salt Lake City, Hutchins, Texas, Byhalia, Missouri. Quite often the people opposing the warehouses are Republicans, and not because they hate ICE detention necessarily, but because they're worried about the economic impact that having enormous facilities might have on local economies and local tax bases too. It's you don't have to think too imaginatively to come up with some really alarming parallels to 20th century human rights disasters to think about where this could go. The idea of huge human warehouses around the country. That's why I say this is going to be a big issue. Back in July, the Trump administration, ICE had put out a memo saying that basically anybody who crossed the border the wrong way at any time, including asylum seekers, people who maybe had adjusted their status later, but still have active immigration cases, really millions of people, no matter how long they've been living in the country, it could be many years, were all now subject to detention. They reinterpreted a 1996 law saying, no, they should never have been let out on bond. They should be held in detention pending the resolution of their immigration cases. And that's been happening to people constantly, often as they show up for their ICE check-ins or they show up for their court cases in immigration court. They get detained and locked up with this memo as the justification. You crossed the border the wrong way in, 2017, and now you have to be locked up. The only way to get people out has been to file habeas corpus cases, of which 20,200 federal lawsuits for habeas corpus for individuals and families have been filed just since the Trump administration took office. And in an enormous majority of those cases, federal district judges have been granting the habeas and ordering people let out of detention. 373 judges have ruled in favor of such cases, and only 28 have sided with the Trump administration. 64 of the judges are Trump appointed, and 44 of them have gone against the Trump administration's preference and ordered people free. This is not popular with most district judges by far, but in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which oversees Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and also north of 40% of the current detained population, a three-judge panel, two of the three judges found with the Trump administration and upheld this interpretation of the 1996 law. So for now, people in those states are very much subject to detention, and also ICE can arrest people anywhere else and send them to a detention center in one of those three states where their case would be moved and upheld, their detention could be upheld. So the recipe for detaining millions of people, filling those warehouses, is set. Of course, this is all under appeal. It's likely to go to the Supreme Court at some point, but that could take months, God forbid, years. So this is going to be in place for a while. And that memo and subsequent jurisprudence is a key element, a real major brick in the wall of the Trump administration's detention expansion. And boy, the allegations about abuse in ICE custody just keep pouring in. I have a long list of examples in the border update. Now, I'm not even going to read them all, but the AP looked into ICE data and found that 7,200 people out of those 68,000 or 70,000, whatever, have been in ICE detention for more than 6 months already. 79 of them have been in ICE detention for more than 2 years. That's a prison sentence that you don't know how many years it is, because it really just depends on how long it is till your case is closed and they feel that they can deport you. They're deliberately wearing people down so that they desist with their immigration or asylum cases and agree to leave the country. There's just a pile of stories about women being separated from nursing infants, pregnant women being mistreated and denied medical care, some of them even having miscarriages, unable to get medical assistance even when they're quite pregnant. And that goes, of course, against ICE's own written standards. The Women's Refugee Commission Physicians for Human Rights just paid a trip to Honduras, as we did with WRC last summer, and talked to more women who arrived from Honduras and found more examples of mothers who were taken away from their U.S. citizen children and not given even the option of bringing them with them, according to the women. There's at least 32 children that Notice was able to find in 7 states who have entered their state's foster care systems basically as orphans after their parents were detained or deported. So there's a lot of family separation going on without getting the kind of headlines that we saw in 2018. There's just so much. Really horrific testimonies of conditions in the Baltimore and New York federal buildings where people are, we think, temporarily held, although those stays end up being longer than they should as they await court hearings or are held for other reasons. The Camp East Montana tent facility on Fort Bliss in El Paso, run by an inexperienced contractor given a $1.2 billion contract, where 3 detained migrants died in December and January. Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, who represents most of El Paso, paid a visit recently and found there are 2 active tuberculosis cases, 18 COVID-19 cases. There's more than 3,000 people crammed into those tents right now. An Irish citizen who actually was here legally but got detained there and has been there for a couple of months talked to reporters from the Irish Times and said that the Fort Bliss facility is, quote, like a concentration camp, absolute hell, and people there are full of anxiety and depression. Outside the Otay Mesa Detention Center, which is a facility run by the contractor Core Civic near San Diego, protesters are gathered on most days, and inmates, detainees, I should say, have been throwing lotion bottles or AA batteries or deodorant bottles with notes in them, and they're throwing them in. The protesters scramble to get the notes, and they just talk about the kind of conditions that they're suffering here. One note read, "It's cold here all the time. The food is poor. For 280 days, we haven't eaten a single piece of fruit, banana, apple, orange, or anything fresh. We're all in one big room with no doors or windows. We can't see any grass or trees. We are all constantly sick." Medieval and happening right now all over the United States. Now, Core Civic also runs the Dilley Immigration Processing Center, which is basically the one facility right now, at least, that the Trump administration is using to detain families. It is the only family detention facility ICE runs at the moment. That actually opened during the Obama administration. This is a bipartisan thing, this family detention. It closed, though, after Joe Biden took office, and then the Trump administration reopened it in early 2025. Since then, about 3,500 adults or children have been detained there. There's about 1,400 people there right now, which is about triple the number that were there. Not quite triple, but almost the number that were there in October. And, there's a 2015 amendment to a 30-year-old court settlement, the Flores Agreement, that says that children should not be held in these kind of conditions for more than 20 days unless they have a final order of removal. That appears to be being violated pretty flagrantly, as a lot of kids are being held in Dili for weeks and weeks and weeks, if not months. A former worker at Dili told Adrian Carrasquillo of the Bulwark, all the kids are sick. I had never gotten sick before, the worker said, but when I worked there, I was always sick. It's hard for the children to sleep because the lights are always on in the rooms. 2 families and 1 immigration lawyer told the New York Times that CoreCivic's medical staff at Dili refused to treat children with stomach ailments, quote, unless they had already vomited at least 8 times. Just a harrowing investigation from ProPublica, who got access to Dili in January, features the testimonies of children who were detained there with their parents, describing the harsh conditions. Some of these kids have been there for as many as 113 days. There's cases of self-harm, suicidal ideation. There's no education. There's not much for them to do all day. The guards are reportedly quite rude. ProPublica got a sheaf of letters and drawings from the children talking about the conditions that they're living in, and they are gut-wrenching to read. And then Pablo Manriquez of Migrant Insider tweeted that staff at Dili have begun raiding the dormitories of kids and their parents to confiscate and destroy any letters from the children. Letters and drawings have been ripped up so they don't make their way out. A San Antonio-based reporter posted to her Instagram a video of a 15-year-old girl showing a pile of shredded, colorful paper after guards had stormed into her room looking for drawings and letters. This is bad stuff. This is even without talking about the case of Juan Nicolas, a 2-month-old baby in Dili who got very sick, had bronchitis, was choking on his vomit. It was very hard to get medical care. He was finally rushed to the hospital. Representative Joaquin Castro, who represents much of San Antonio, got involved to try to accompany the family. The baby was barely let out of the hospital, still in feeble condition, and ICE deported the family immediately into Mexico, putting them right across the border with only the $190 they had in the Dili commissary. Okay, let's switch to the border wall. The big, beautiful bill also gave $46.5 billion to CBP to build new border barriers up and down the border. That is about triple what the Trump administration during its first term had managed to allocate for itself, even through emergency measures. So we're talking about a lot more wall building getting underway. Rodney Scott, the commissioner of CBP, told the Congressional Homeland Security Committees in those hearings that CBP has already placed $12 billion in wall funding on contract, with all the remaining contracts scheduled to be awarded by June 30th, and they expect to have 250 miles of new border barriers built by September 30th. As with all border wall construction over the last 20 years, it is enabled and expedited by Section 102 of the Real ID Act of 2005. This was a bill that passed bipartisanly with this one provision in it that allows DHS to waive 48 different environmental and cultural protection laws, historical preservation laws. Everything from the Endangered Species Act to the Clean Water Act can be waived in order to just let the wall get built, even in public lands and wildlife preserves and other properties like that. So a waiver of 28 laws is allowing construction of more than 150 miles of barriers in far west Texas, from a place where not many people cross, to be honest, from east of El Paso all the way into state parkland near Big Bend National Park. And there will be additional barriers even built in Big Bend National Park, which is one of our major national treasures, which does follow the border in far west Texas. It's going to really be a scar on this park. Similar work, there's blasting going on in the mountains of the Coronado National Memorial in southeast Arizona to allow wall construction to continue. And leaders of the Tohono O'odham Nation, whose lands, much reduced historically, their remaining lands, still straddle the border between Arizona and Sonora, about 62 miles of border. They traveled to Washington last week to voice very strong opposition to plans to actually build real barriers beyond what they have now that would effectively seal them off. And again, these waivers are allowing that to happen. There is blasting already also happening on the south face of Mount Cristo Rey, which is that giant mountain that sits to the west of El Paso along the border, also along the border with New Mexico. It's an iconic place, and they're blasting there in order to build more border wall there. This is a place where a lot of religious pilgrimages happen. That's the one, the mountain, the big cross on top. But it is also a place where a lot of migrants cross because it is near a pretty populated part of Ciudad Juarez and not too far from El Paso. But conservationists warn that closing this new wall off is also going to make it harder for wildlife to cross back and forth through the natural corridor, which does threaten their survival. Meanwhile, on Wednesday of this week, CBP released data about law enforcement events at the border in January. It shows a 6% drop in Border Patrol apprehensions of migrants from December to January. Just 6,070 people ended up in Border Patrol custody. In an average month in the Biden administration, it was about 25 times more than that, 155,000 people. Even during Trump's first term, it was 7 times more than that, 42,000 people a month, 6,070. And that's, of course, because there's no such thing as being able to turn yourself in and ask for asylum. That remains suspended under a January presidential proclamation that continues to face slow challenges in the courts. It's also just simply because everybody's seeing the same videos we are and hearing the same testimonies we are about the climate of fear that exists for migrants inside the United States. So why would someone want to come and try to live here and look over their shoulder all the time when ICE and CBP are unleashed and much of the immigration system's deck is stacked against them? So, we've seen this very sharp drop in arrivals for a while now. There have now been 12 full months of data since the Trump administration took over, February through January. And during those 12 months, there were 85,868 people apprehended by Border Patrol. And, the last time we had a full fiscal year with that few people was 1967, when 74,000 people were apprehended. So these are roughly 60-year lows in migrant flows. Things have gone down since either September or October. I don't have it in front of me. But yeah, during the winter, the numbers are down. I would expect numbers not to jump, but to increase in the spring as the weather gets nicer, and maybe drop again in the summer as the desert heat takes a toll of these people to stop coming. One thing about these numbers, January was the third lowest monthly total since the Trump administration began of these 12 full months, but it was the number one lowest total for children and family unit members apprehended. Only 627 children and family unit members entered Border Patrol custody last month. I have data on, broken down by that demographic since October of 2011, and this was the lowest month for children and family. About 90% of the Border Patrol apprehended population was single adult, and we haven't seen that few family members really ever, but this is definitely a part of the new trend. About 71% of January's apprehended migrants were from Mexico. That is following the last year's trend as well. Add in the northern part of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and you're well over 90% of the total, which is sort of the patterns you saw before the pandemic, before people started coming across the Darien Gap and coming from other countries. The Rio Grande Valley sector in South Texas, across from Tamaulipas, Mexico, is, for the third month in a row, the part of the border where Border Patrol found the most migrants trying to cross, apprehended the most migrants. That's followed by El Paso and then Tucson, Arizona. In terms of drug seizures, CBP seized 767 pounds of fentanyl, 84% of that, which is normal at the ports of entry. It's interesting that fentanyl seizures during the first 4 months of the fiscal year have averaged about 1,030 pounds a month. This is a little bit lower than that 4-month average. Not that that's a trend or anything, but it is interesting that during fiscal 2025, those 12 months, the average was 957 pounds a month. So 1,030 the first 4 months compared to 957. We may be seeing a leveling off or maybe even a slight increase in the amount of fentanyl that authorities are finding along the border. That's significant because we saw drops in 2024, 23 to 24, and 24 to 25. If that's leveling off or even increasing, that might be the end of the decline in fentanyl that has been making some recent reporting. Too early to tell. But it is super interesting to see a plateau after some pretty striking drops in the previous 2 years. Border seizures of cocaine were lower than usual in January, but still the average over the last few months is still reasonably high. And if you look at seizures nationally, you include the little bit that comes at the Canada border, but also what is seized by CBP at coast and in the U.S. interior. There are actually almost 6,000 pounds seized, which is a pretty robust month. The reason I bring this up is because there have been 39, as of right now, boat strikes, lethal military attacks on boats suspected of carrying drug trafficking. We'll never know if they were or not because none of these people received due process and they and the evidence are on the bottom of the ocean. But presumably, those have been going on since September 2nd. We're in month 6 of these boat strikes. You'd think there might be some deterrent effect, but they haven't moved the needle on the amount of cocaine that CBP is finding. In fact, if you average the months since September and compare it to the prior 12 months cocaine seizures, the time since September is actually 6% higher, which means the U.S. authorities are actually finding more. So it's still making its way. Cocaine is still making its way to the United States, despite these 39 attacks that have killed 146 people so far. Just a few things in the other news column of the border update. Whenever I say other news, that means we're almost done with these mammoth beasts of reports. But boy, look, there's so much going on. The Democrats on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee published a pretty useful report talking about the cost and the slapped together nature of the Trump administration's deportations of migrants to third countries, which are based on agreements with those countries. In some cases, there have been agreements or at least arrangements or one-off sendings of migrants to 20 countries around the world where they've sent other countries' citizens. Most of them go to Mexico, which takes well over 1,000 migrants from other countries every month across the land border. But this report talks about particularly 5 countries, Equatorial Guinea, Rwanda, El Salvador, Eswatini, and Palau, which together got well over $30 million in some cases, just like bulk payments from the U.S. government, from the Trump administration to take third country nationals. And so far, about 300 citizens of third countries, 250 or so of them just to El Salvador, have been sent, which when you do the math, more than 30 million divided by 300, that's more than $100,000 per detained person, which is quite striking. The New York Times' Carol Rosenberg reporter has been doing just a bang-up job keeping track of what's going on with the use of the Guantanamo Bay Naval Station to hold migrants, which the Trump administration has done from time to time with about still less than 800 people have passed through Guantanamo over the last year. But she was following the case of these 55 Cuban men. And remember, Guantanamo Bay is in the island of Cuba. The United States just owned that little spot of Cuba since the Spanish-American War. 55 Cuban men who had been in the ICE detention system were sent there in a few batches in December and kept in Camp 6, the place that used to hold al-Qaeda suspects, for several weeks. And then just mysteriously in early February, they just put them back on planes and brought them back to the United States. We still don't know what the heck went on there, but it is absolutely bizarre and very expensive, actually, to move that many people around to Guantanamo and back, and we don't know what that was for. The CBP plans to spend $225,000 per year on access to Clearview AI's facial recognition platform. Wired reported this. It's based on more than 60 billion publicly available images that the company has scraped from the internet. I guess like line officers out there, won't be using it, but CBP's intelligence officers will absolutely have access to Clearview AI so they can identify all of our faces more quickly and easily. Nicaragua has reinstated visa requirements for visitors from Cuba, Haiti, and about 126 other countries. For several years there, Nicaragua had been welcoming people from those countries, including hundreds of thousands of Cubans, as long as they paid a fee. When they arrived, they didn't need a visa ahead of time. A lot of Cubans and some Haitians, and a lot of people from Africa too, arrived in Nicaragua, linked up with smugglers, and made their way to the U.S. border, often to ask for asylum. And, people from Cuba, Haiti, or those African countries often have pretty compelling cases for asylum. But that route has been shut down, and it's interesting that the Ortega government decided to do that. That's been a frequent request of the Trump and even the Biden administrations to shut that down. But they did it only weeks after the January 3rd raid in Venezuela that extracted a close Ortega ally, dictator Nicolas Maduro, from Caracas, and suddenly there's a bit more cooperation on that from Daniel Ortega. Of course, people were not taking that route lately anyway, because there's no such thing as asylum in the United States for the moment anyway. So that route had more or less dried up. Cubans who do want to leave, and they have very strong reasons to leave because the Trump administration has threatened any other country that provides Cuba with oil, and the economy is in free fall and probably facing maybe even famine in the coming weeks and months. Real compelling reasons to leave Cuba. If they do, options seem to be maybe Guyana, which doesn't require visas still for visiting Cubans, or Brazil, where a lot of Cubans have been arriving and asking for asylum in the airport and other means of getting there. That's about it. There are not a lot of safety valves for Cubans or Haitians unless they get on rafts and risk their lives trying to make it to the United States. And it's not clear that the Trump administration would ever let them stay. Anyway, there's a few other bullet points in the other news that are worth noting, particularly Colombia reporting 21,056 southbound migrants who came through, not really through the Darien Gap, maybe a few came southbound, but mostly taking maritime routes around the Darien Gap through the Caribbean as they gave up on seeking asylum in the United States and went to settle back in Colombia and or Venezuela. That flow is much less by the end of the year last year than it was at the beginning of last year. That's the border update. This whole episode with the drones, the expansion of a very abusive detention system, the border wall, and people just stopping coming to the border because of everything they're hearing about everything I just mentioned. It is really an alarming moment. We are going to continue monitoring as we have been. I like doing these updates, even though they take a lot of time because they force me to do the reading and keep up on what colleagues and journalists are uncovering, as well as the data. So, hey, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I will try to keep it up. I may miss an update from time to time when things get busy, but obviously if the viewership numbers go up, I will be compelled to make more of these. So if you find this useful, either as an audio or a video podcast, please do listen. Please do tell your friends. Please do get the word out. Because, if I ever see that readership number go up on the graph, I'm going to carve out more time to do these. If not, it'll still be a labor of love because it is forcing me to practice how to do these communications. That's all for now.